right, today's session, it's going to be around adopting NDD into existing projects. And so we're going to go over how to think about a POC and also how to get buy-in and the different considerations for bringing NDD into existing projects. So let's start with three things about NDD. Really maps to three main levels: planning, execution, and then documentation. So let's just go over those real quick. From a planning perspective, you can use it. You got anything new that's coming up, you want to get a bunch of people on the same page. You run a planning session with narratives, and that helps identify the gaps, what's missing, who needs to do what, and so on. So there's a whole planning aspect to narratives. And then there's execution. You're on the ground, you're doing the work. People need to know what they're working on, or they find the gap in something they are working on. That is execution level. And in documentation, that's the stuff that you get out the other side. If you do this practice continuously, then you'll have ongoing documentation that you can go back and look at. Unlike a Jira ticket, which once it's finished, it's closed and it goes into the done cemetery. A narrative is long-lived and you can use it as documentation. Now, you don't have to use it for all of these things, right? You can use it for just one of those things. You can use it just for planning. You can use it just for execution. And in a way, documentation maybe by itself can't be done, but certainly for the planning and the execution, you can pick one of those to do. So I'm gonna start by showing you some of the techniques to do both planning and execution, and then we can see how you can bring that into an existing project. So I'll share my screen and start drawing things on the narrative app. As always, let's start with an example. So we need a fictitious example from the group for an existing system that we'd like to introduce NDD into. So who's got a suggestion?
I'm trying to think of something we haven't used before.
Maybe a Spotify, something like that.
Spotify, okay. You can imagine with somewhere like Spotify, you're going to have a whole bunch of different narratives out there. One would be like user listens to their favorite podcasts. And we'd have another for XYZ. Let's just say there's just loads and loads of narratives out there that already exist for Spotify. But none of these have been logged, right? And we're going to work on something new, let's say. In this, it's an existing landscape, but we want to start using narrative in this existing landscape. And we're going to actually use it to change a feature that already exists. So let's go and look at this. User listens to their favorite podcast, and it's something that already exists. So the first thing we want to do is just map out the current state of that outcome. So how does a user listen to their favorite podcast? The final moment is that the podcast is played on the player, or it started on the player, I should say. So then the first moment is that they find a set of podcasts they are interested in. They pick one. I'm just going to keep it nice and simple. They pick a specific cast, and the player starts playing it. So let's say this is the current state of things. This is how the system exists today. And it shouldn't take long for people to get on the same page as to what the system does today. If you haven't got any documentation anywhere, this is your opportunity to start documenting how that system works. You're bringing in the knowledge from either just yourself or a group of people to come and note that knowledge down. So this is using the sequence time modeling approach of saying moment by moment what's happening. The next thing to do would be to say, now that we have an understanding of what the current functionality is, we can go and add additional things to it. And so then you'd be able to, like, what do we want to add here? So user listening to their favorite podcast. This is a simple 3-step process that they carry out today. What is it we want to change here? Take us.
I don't know, make available offline, something like that, a little incremental value add.
Awesome. So yeah, basically this is the new thing we want to add here, is to make something available offline. So the user chooses to make the cast available offline. And so at this point, what we can say is this is new. This is the new part. So we can just add a label to say this is the thing we want to start working on, and these other things are existing. So we'll just put that in as existing. We'll add it there. We'll add it to this guy. This is existing. We can change those colors a little bit. I'll just make this new one a blue or a purple. Why not a purple? That didn't work. I didn't save it. Just so we can easily differentiate between them. There we go. This will work. Okay, so this is the new thing that we want to start working on. And so the next thing would be we now want to get the relevant people involved. And this is the standard narrative approach, is that you take the business context first, then you overlay the user interfaces, then you overlay the systems required to fulfill it. So here we can say that the interface required is going to be the offline widget. And you'd put that over here, and that's how we're going to expose this value. And once you select that you want to download something offline, that will then trigger the system to fetch the offline version of the cast. And we can later define how that's going to happen. And so again, we'll say that this is a net new thing. This is a net new thing. And we can start to look deeper into what's required here. So this might be a task for the UX team. If you're starting with narratives, you might start with a task for the UX team here to go ahead and create this offline widget. Or you might have already gone through the design process of building this here. Now you're just saying, we've already got the designs, and therefore you can bring the designs in. That would be something like, we'll just grab a look at a Spotify screenshot somewhere like that. Let's just say that's the UX for it that we've pulled in. And we'll add that up here, put it on this offline widget that shows us, just give it a second to load. And this is what the user experience is going to look like. And this starts to allow us to understand the amount of work that's required. And so, yes, these things are existing, and we don't have to go map all of these right now. We're just focused on planning the new things that we need in order to execute on this functionality. And it's given us context. We're free to go back and fully document these at a future date, but we don't have to. We only needed them to create the context for what everybody already knows about the app in a specific company. So for Spotify, everyone will know what picking a cast looks like, what finding the podcast looks like, and starting to play it. But not many people know the new things that need to happen in the middle here. So what you then do is you go ahead and add the details. And soon we're going to have a better way of linking this. But what you can also say is, let's say you now want to create some tickets for these things. You'd then go ahead and put these, you'd say that this is part of Jira ticket 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is part of Jira 5, whatever the ticket numbers are. And you can start to say that we're going to go track this work on these specific task trackers. So what you've got here is a quick way to see in context what it is that you're trying to build, how it fits in the greater picture, and you only have to get started on one thing at a time. And this is actually a great way to POC this, is just to pick one feature, one new thing that you're working on, create a narrative based on what exists today, and then insert the new things that you want to do as part of that narrative. Stop there for a few questions and see if anyone has any thoughts on this.
I just wanted to say this is awesome, seeing it evolve from what I saw it like before. So this is great.
Thanks. Thank you.
What are some of the common problems you have with people who struggle to articulate or acknowledge or recognize the actual narratives that are present?
So if I just understand that, you mean those who don't necessarily understand the full context that you're going through?
Maybe the challenge is that we don't actually understand the context, or that we have different mental models. Therefore, it's not easy to simply visualize it.
Yeah, and that happens. Yes, that's a very good point. That does happen quite a lot. What we've seen is working with some clients is that the information may not be available. Like we have, let me just go back to that same one right there. Let's say there's something here where is not sure what happens here. And it's like, we know that there's a gap in our knowledge. This is an unknown. And so what we say is either and we can label that as a blocker, or we can say it's a TBC, something like that. So it's all about finding ways for us to come back and get a complete version of the truth. If you don't know the truth at this point in time, that's okay, but just mark it as such. Say, we're making an assumption here. You can label it as an assumption. And we're going to come back to this. And then you can come back later and say, all right, I want to see what assumptions have we made. So then you can just filter those out and you can see, all right, we've got an assumption here. Who's the right person that we need to talk to about this? And so what you can do is you can put a comment and you can mention someone. I don't know if I have anyone on here. Andy, sure. Can you please look at this? And so, ultimately what we're trying to do in this is create a centralized view of the truth. That's what this is really all about. If we don't know that truth, let's mark it as such. If we're making some assumptions, let's make it as such. Let's pull in the different people that can help us create that progressive JPEG of the truth, right? Like it's layering piece by piece until it finally all makes sense.
I can imagine working with different silos to create the narrative as they can see it, and then seeing, okay, this is where these narratives actually connect and interface, and how we can see the larger string across these different silos.
Exactly. And like you can say that this comes from this journey of team, like something that team A is working on, which might be like the podcast ingestion, let's call it, like where stuff has been. There's another team that's responsible for bringing in the podcasts all together. We don't know quite what happens there, so we'll just put that as a placeholder and come back to it later to understand. But that's the general pattern. Is yes, feel free to make assumptions if you don't have the right people in the room. And then just make sure to put a placeholder to go validate that assumption is actually true. So that's the approach there. I did have something else in mind just then as you were talking about people not being in the room. Yeah, it's the concept of not just a single source of truth, but also something that has to progress, right? And so you're never going to get it right the first time round. You start with what you know, and then you iterate in order to get the full truth out there.
And it makes it easier for people to point out something that's wrong or conflicts with their understanding.
That's what the time-based modeling does. As soon as you start putting things into sequences, that's when our time brains kick in and start to spot problems with the story, right? And so when you sequence things, that is the power that you get from that. And then you're coupling that with hey, we don't actually know what happens here, and we don't have the right person in the room to tell us that. So let's mark that as such, but keep moving. All right, so I'm just going to quickly look and see what else we wanted to cover in today's session. So this part here is the planning, right? So we've started to think about this new feature that we want to build. We have existing podcasts and we wanted to make it available offline. So we added just a few steps in there. You can complicate that accordingly. It could just be as simple as this. It could be one team that's going to do this work. It could be two teams. In this case, it might be the user experience, the folks over here that are in a separate team, depending on your organization, to the ones who are working on the back end to do this work. Putting in the Jira tickets and links to them, you can do that here right now. We are adding some actual much deeper integration into Jira, but for now, it's just going to be something like this, where you have ticket 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can reference it, but we're adding more and more where you'll get the status of the actual tickets in here. But that's still planning, right? This is us in the process of saying, here are all the things that we want to do. We have got agreement that these are the things we want to do. We've linked the information to Figmas and Jiras and all the other places where we have information. And we've created this virtualized source of truth for that information. And what this is doing is it's creating high bandwidth, high quality communication between the teams. If there's one thing that NDD is all about, it's about creating high quality, high bandwidth communication between the teams. And that's what leads to better outcomes. So the planning phase is the starting point for that. Then we get into the execution. So the execution is that people can then go ahead and pick these Jira tickets up. They go and work on things. But we also want to be a bit more specific about what happens. So if I then grab a specification from here and say, this is the offline version download component or module that we're going to create, and I'll put these specs onto this box, and I'll open this box, and then we start to decide what it should and it should not do. Or I might say it in the given, when, then format. And as simple as this looks, it's actually the information that the execution requires in order to execute. So what is execution and delivery? It is the translation of intention into reality, right? Into actual code. And the intention is best specified by way of specifications. You can specify it by way of verbal words, and those are specifications, but then they're ephemeral and they disappear into air. But if you note them down, then you have now a specific way of saying something, aka a specification, which is the communication to the team that is going to do the work. And so now you're getting into a much lower level. You're going from planning into execution. Similarly here, these screenshots right now, it's just a rudimentary screenshot of Spotify. But if this linked out to Figma along with some previews of Figma, which is coming soon, then you have visual specifications of what you need to create, right? It's telling you the spacing, the pixels, the size, the fonts, the breakpoints, all of that stuff. Those are specifications. They're visual specifications. And when we look at the system down here, what it's telling us is in these what we say in these boxes would be what we like to call here are component behaviors, which are best defined in it should nots in my experience. And then the other thing that you get are domain behaviors, and those are best defined in given when then scenarios from my experience. You can use either, you can use what you want. You can use bullet points if you like, but those from experience, it shoulds are great for components, and given when thens are great for behaviors. So yeah, that's how we start creeping into the execution world, by starting to specify at a deeper level what needs to be done. And now when you have a Jira ticket that you open up and you want to see, hey, what do I actually need to work on when I'm executing? And you can come back to here and you can see this is the context of what you're creating. Here's what everybody else around you is going to be creating to make sure this works. And here's what you're going to be creating based on these specifications, which hopefully you were a part of defining in the first place. All right. And so that's what you want to do. You want to create high bandwidth, high quality communication with the teams by bringing them onto the same page. And then when they go to execute, they would already be prepped up. Their brains will be doped up with all the right information for them to execute on the right outcomes. Pause for a minute there, see if there's any thoughts or questions.
Sam, do you want to talk about getting the right people in the room a little bit? I know that this is like a different paradigm for a lot of folks, and there will be more people involved in this versus standard planning. So that's a big question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at the planning stage, what you want to do is you can start with a party of one, which is you, or you can add the people with the knowledge. I would advise against having sessions with 20 plus people. Those get too busy, and then you end up with just people watching and maybe not even watching, going and doing something on their computer anyway. So it's better to have a high bandwidth, a high communication, high collaboration approach. If you've got a front ender who's involved, bring them in. If you've got a back end the back end person that's involved, bring them in. At which point do you bring them in? It depends on your team and how you guys work. So if you're the kind of company that drives everything by user experience, which is very common, then you might just want to have this as the product owner and user experience person first getting together to create these narratives. If you're the kind of company that is tech driven, as in the delivery folks are the people that drive the delivery, then you might want to get your tech and UX people first involved to go through the screens, see what's on the screens, what systems you need to create out of it, and start to plan it out that way. So it really depends. We've seen it in quite a few different combinations. Some people that are high from product drive this. Some people from tech drive this. It's usually one of those two. People from experience typically don't drive this because they prefer to use the tools of choice like Figma and so on. So that's not been common so far for designers to drive it, or experienced designers. But certainly the tech folks are super interested in knowing how everything's going to work, and the product people interested in the actual outcomes that are going to be achieved. So the answer is, who do you bring in? First of all, figure out which kind of company you are. Are you tech driven? Are you product driven? Who are your glue people? Like usually there's one or two people in your team that are what we call glue people. They're the ones that usually drive the team. They find all the information. They give you an index page. They make sure the tickets are up to date. They connect people to make sure the information is correct. So find those glue people. If they're in your product team, then they're the ones that drive it. If they're in your tech team, then they're the ones that will be driving it. So that's your driver. And then the drivers will pull in the right people to complete the information. So who do you pull in? It's whoever has a role to play in that narrative.
It sounds like you're saying that recognizing what kind of company you are influences where you draw the boundaries or the fault lines between narratives.
Exactly correct. Exactly correct. Because if you're a tech heavy or tech driven, you're going to be really focused on the time sequencing. Like you're going to care a lot about that because you want to know what happens when, who does what systems we need to call, what specifications we need for those systems and so on. That's going to be extremely important to you. And so when you're from a service design / product point of view, you're going to be interested in more like the outcome, a few key moments in that outcome, but the rest maybe less about what you truly care about and just more about it being correct and working, if that makes sense. It's more of a solution level. It's not the problem domain. Like the tech people are always focused on the solution and the product people are more focused on the problem domain. And so if you look at the problem domain, it's easily expressed with what outcome do we want to achieve and what are the key moments in that solution. Whereas the solution people are really interested in, we need to know exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, what happens, like with no gaps.
So a benefit of finding a glue person is that you can rely on their preferred lens. Whereas if you have a lot of people in the room, you increase the chance that they're all looking through different lenses, like a process lens versus a system lens versus a user lens or an outcome lens.
Yeah. To some degree, yes. I think it's the glue people is less about the lens that they have, that there's definitely some impact to that, but more about who's going to actually drive the session, who's going to care to fill this out and keep it alive and working. Make sure that this is an artifact that you are using. And so let's just think about what glue people do today without this tool or without this practice. What they do is they have a spreadsheet or they have a Miro board or they have some Confluence page, an index of some kind, where they hold all the information for a specific thing that's being done. From the research we've done, like with folks, that could be a Jira ticket that has links to everything. It could be a Confluence page that references all the Jira tickets, all the Figmas, all the components and so on. And that's where you go to find the right information. And so what glue people do is they create virtualized sources of the truth for you so that you can have high quality, high bandwidth information. That's instinctively what they want to do. And so now what we're saying is we have a way to create a standardized way for creating virtualized sources of truth. And the people that are going to care about that the most are your existing glue people. So find those glue people, get them to own this new way of working, and then they will use this as the new kind of index, a new source of truth to share the information with everybody.
Sam, is it assumed that these glue people also have the bandwidth to understand the same objectives that a business stakeholder would have in this process and to understand the technical aspects of this process? Should this glue person be super well-rounded, or are they more about getting the information from those various sources and then putting it into a flow of a narrative?
So yeah, you're saying like, are they the actual creators of the narratives versus are they facilitating other people coming in to fill in the narratives? That is, that's a great call out. The answer is both. It depends.
Yeah.
Whichever it is. If you're the glue person that does it, power to you. Go ahead and do it. If not, and we're working with a client right now that isn't that, but wants to see this complete, and he's making sure that all the right people are doing the thing to keep these up to date and alive.
Yeah, makes sense.
So the other thing to do is in order to make it work at an execution level, what you want to do is you want to start your stand-ups and or just not necessarily start with your stand-ups, but include this in your stand-ups. We stylistically start with this in the stand-up. We're saying, what outcomes are we focused on? This outcome here, user listens to their favorite podcast. Let's change that now. User downloads an offline version of their favorite podcast or an offline version. So when you start your stand-up, you want to know, are we focused on the prior world, we'd call it the sprint goal, and now we focused on the business outcome. Like, it doesn't matter how many sprints this takes because this is the priority. So are we focused on creating this? And if not, if you're working on something else, what is it you're working on, and why isn't it the outcome that we all want to work on? And so this acts as a good way to just every single day make sure that everyone's pointing towards the same waypoint. So if you have the stand up and you're going through the narratives and you're saying we're actively working on these 3 narratives in our planning script, so we've decided it's 1, 2, 3 that we're working on. As the different team members talk about the narratives they're working on, if it's something tangential, then it's worth the discussion. It's not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. Sometimes there are good reasons to do something like a refactor that's needed elsewhere and so on. But it's a good way to keep everybody focused on a daily basis. You say, these are the narratives. Does this track? Typically, people go through a workflow board to doing done because you've already done the planning session. You've put everything on that board. But what about what other teams are doing that you depend on? That's not usually visible. If I'm working on this box here and another box down here, but I'm dependent on team A and team B to do their work on the other stuff, that's not usually very visible from tickets unless you say is related to ticket, and it's just not very fathomable, right? It's not as easy to grok when you look at a ticket with the dependencies to external things. Whereas here you're saying, in order for this outcome to be achieved, these teams are blocking this outcome from being achieved, or we are blocking another team from the outcome being achieved. So this daily stand-up, bringing us into the daily stand-up just gives you higher bandwidth, higher quality information for you to work with.
Sam, this is a really stupid kind of procedural question, but I see we have comments on here. We can add comments. Can you also tag someone and bring them in so that they're essentially, okay, yeah, we're quick. And with respect to those other teams, if they have other projects in narrative that are driving what they're doing, is there a way to link those?
Yes, you can see this here. There's just a list of workspaces that we have. Under the hood, it's all one big model for all your workspaces. So we can absolutely link them. Love to see what some of those features are going to be, but certainly that's on the roadmap. Right now, there is not a way to link another workspace into this workspace other than just creating a link like this. I might reference another workspace from here so that you can go to it. That is easily doable. Would love to understand more about use cases where kind of links we'd do. I know it's coming. I just don't know exactly what it looks like yet. Oh, my camera's frozen again. You guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Just
Yep.
camera's acting up. So yeah, what other questions do you guys have?
I've got a similar kind of procedural question. I know we touched on this a little bit last week, but just to make sure I fully understand, it feels as a matter of convention or perhaps intention, when there's an entry in the system lane, the vertical column is almost always empty. The implications of that is that things that occur in the system are time divorced from elements of interaction or context. You remind me, what's the reasoning there? Or I guess, is there ever a case where we have a vertical column that contains something more than a system of interaction?
Oh, I see. I got you. Yeah, like why do we constrain them? Sorry, my camera's playing up.
No worries.
Bring that back. You can have my other camera. So yeah, the reason is because at a specific point in time, like if I try and remove this here, it'll say to me, I can't do it, right? You can see they're saying red. And we're very careful about that. And that's because parallelism, right? Like we want this to be a sequence. And from there are 4 types of interactions, or sorry, transitions, let's call them. So going from interface to interface, that's navigation. I've navigated from screen A to screen B. Going from system to an interface, that is a query or a fetch, that is data. And then going from a screen, an interface, I should say, to a system, that is a command. And then finally, we have from system to system, which will be a reaction. And so make sure
and the rule is they have to go forward in time.
Exactly. Precisely. There's a transition from one to another. And so when you put,
okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's what helps you fall into the pit of success. Is we want the process to not allow you to do weird stuff, and it marshals the process in this way. And then you can actually open these up and go deeper and have a subsequence. So this is the sequence that happens overall, but there might be 10, 20 different things that happen within here. And that's visible. We are actually toying with the idea of having an alternate view of this whole thing where I can view it as a sequence diagram. Right? Because the data is the same, but we can look at it as a sequence diagram, which means that it now becomes compatible with all standard architecture practices where people create sequence diagrams for a lot of things. Because it's the same thing. It's just a time-based way of modeling.
I often find with sequence diagrams, I spend more time formatting them than actually learning from them. But
Yeah,
to each their own.
Indeed.
In terms of adopting narrative into an existing project, to what extent is it advisable to bring the body of existing specifications into narratives, right? As an example, should it be extensive? Don't bother.
So we spoke about planning, we spoke about execution, and the last one, as I mentioned, is documentation. It really depends on how much you want to use NDD to document your system. It is an alternative way of documentation. Of course, I'm biased and I'm going to say it's superior, but that's me. But it gives you, when you have a document and you put things as bullet points, that's equivalent to what we're looking at here in that it is structured, and structured documents are fantastic. This gives you a structured way of creating those documents. It's visual right now, but just like I said, we can render this as a sequence diagram. We can actually render this as a document as well. As a matter of fact, that's a feature on the cards, to have a bidirectional view of document and visual at the same time, and you modify either and it modifies both. So that's a future feature. But just to speak to the point that this is giving you a standardized way of documenting. And I think that goes a long way. Like, there's a standard way to create the equivalent of user stories as narratives now that are much higher fidelity and have a lot more depth. Like, literally, they have extra dimensions as depth. And now that I've said all that, you've got an existing body of documentation that isn't this standardized and isn't this structured, most likely, unless you're extremely organized. And I have seen some. In fact, we've seen some in the past working together on an Audi project for the design system, and it was exceptionally well documented in Confluence. So I know they exist. That depends on having amazing glue people and an amazing team, and that's not prevalent. And so if we say now, here's a more standardized way of doing it, should you then go back and document your entire body of knowledge into the system? I think that would be a mistake. I think you should not do that. I think you should start where you are and document as much as is needed in order for you to continue moving from here forward. And what that means is that you'll start pulling in things incrementally. And what it means is what you won't be doing is superfluously adding things that aren't necessary, right? And therefore wasting time. It's a bit like when you have a legacy piece of code and you want to deprecate it. One strategy, or you want to replace it, one strategy is to say, we'll keep the existing code running, but anytime we want to modify any piece of code, we will move it to the new system, rewrite it, and use it from there on. And so it becomes a demand-led, demand-driven approach to migration rather than a forced, let's migrate everything, and it takes too long and too much can go wrong. It's not as deadly here, but it's the same kind of concept. Like, it's a wasted effort if you're just going to document things that aren't going to be used for a specific purpose.
I agree. I think the engineering mind's desire for consistency can lead you down some unproductive paths sometimes, right?
Yeah. But yeah, I would resist that unless you want to share a document with somebody. Great, take it out of your existing system and put it into it. Again, speaking to the features of the platform, we are working, or we have on the roadmap, I should say, automatic ingestion of specs, so we can look at your existing body of documentation, try and create narratives for you, look at your code base and create narratives. But these are future roadmap items.
Gotcha.
You've encouraged the specificity in the narrative of being particular, and I'm wondering also about whether you can make the narrative too complex or too big a thing. It does seem like it could work at different levels of abstraction.
Yes.
But have you run into problems where you're trying to map out too large a narrative, or have you found a way to talk at a higher level and then drill down and keep that self-similarity?
We do have, there's a few different parts of that question. One is like the high level organization. We do have this concept of capabilities. If I just show you like, it's very early, but if I just try and even create a direct shape, arrow this way, it doesn't allow it because capabilities are the superset of narratives.
Mhm.
So that's one way of modeling things. The other thing is that narratives can be chained. So we have a narrative that leads to another narrative that leads to another narrative. Structurally, that's what we have available to us today. We have a capability, which is effectively a group of narratives, and then a narrative can be linked to another narrative. So with that in mind, how big should a narrative be? First thing is you should focus on one outcome at a time, no more than one outcome. And if you find that your narrative is growing to be, super long, you've probably got multiple outcomes in there. So I would split that. I would say like it might be first that a customer loads up the user profile screen so that they can, like your customer service representative might want to first load up the user profile screen so that they can take actions from there. And that itself is valuable because they've been able to load it and they're able to move on to the next thing. And then the next one is they can execute a refund. They can execute a data removal request. They can, all the different things that you can do would be independent narratives.
And the relationships are inherently sequential.
Exactly. Now, they can be sequential, but they can also be tangential. I can easily go from this moment to another narrative. Technically, that's sequential, right? I'm going from here to here, down to here, down to there. It's still a linear progression.
But if there are different outcomes that aren't sequential, but that rely on the same systems, we don't have an easy way to show the relationship.
Let's talk about an example. You can try and try and represent that. So something to make it.
I suppose we're using DevOps. We've got different people who are using DevOps for different reasons. It's the same system. We might be making a change in DevOps that impacts one outcome, but it also makes a difference for another outcome. But there may be different users sharing the system.
So if in this case, let's call this, you have a system called DevOps that does X. And if I'm hearing that correctly, you've got a couple of different narratives that rely on the same action or system under the hood, which is called DevOps to do stuff. And over here, this is show foo, and this one over here is show bar. And you want to know that when we do a change in DevOps, that both of these, whoever's responsible for these different aspects, are made aware.
Yeah, or at least how we stay aware that a change in one can affect the other.
Yeah, exactly. So yet another feature on the roadmap is to make these modules reusable. So we already have that right now. If I have a specification over here and I start writing offline, as you can see, it's something I've already used in the past. And that way, if this specification is both here and here, any changes in one will be reflected in the other. So this will be like a change over here, and then I can go open this one, and technically it's exactly the same thing. It's showing us the same data. What we'd like to do is make that also available on the higher level constructs as well, like that DevOps. And then you can set up alerts, which basically would say, I'm interested in changes here. And that way it will notify you when there are changes to something that you care about.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a few different ways. Yeah, it's just to summarize that, like the management of information complexity in the workspace is very difficult, and people do it today using a whole bunch of different techniques. And what we want to do here is find ways to enable that. And so by way of higher level categorization, linking of narratives, branching of narratives, forking, joining, and commenting, and also subscribing to certain information changes, the combination of all of those, you should be able to find something that suits your need.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. Adding things like in terms of the practice, labels are very powerful. Attributes will be another thing where I can say this is part of component A, part of component B, or it has a return of investment of X. So the combination of labels, attributes, and relationships become together they become very powerful. And then if we give you a way to query that information, then it's all in one place. But yeah, so we digressed a little bit, which is always nice and fun. But bringing this back to the main subject of the huddle today, we said that bring in NDD into existing projects, start with something that is, get on the same page with the folks that are going to be working on this. Bring in your glue people into the picture, since they're going to bring everybody else in. Have them drive this. And use it as a planning level in this way, where you can start to map out what exists and what doesn't exist, create the relevant tasks, and then track this on a daily basis in your stand-ups, where you can see what affects you from other teams, how you affect other teams, and whether you're always focused on delivering the outcome. And that's what brings it into the execution phase. And then once you're done and all of this is complete, we can remove all these labels, and then this becomes your long-lived documentation. And this is your first starting point, and you can iterate and grow this practice from here so that you have more and more being documented. And when you want to change a feature that's already been documented, well, you just go back and find its narrative and then go and modify it from there. You can actually start at execution as well. Like you can start with a bottom up. You don't have to start with the moments. You can start with systems and interfaces and not even have any moments. And then you can ask the question, why are we doing this in the first place? What outcome does this actually enable? And then go ahead and fill in the outcomes. It's actually a very eye-opening technique, because we are working with some teams where they just create the data layer and they just make this data available to everybody, but they don't know how the data is actually being used. It's okay, let's put some color around that. Let's look at a sequence of that data being used and which journeys that enables and what outcomes that enables. And it becomes a big eye opener for the engineers that are otherwise just worried about building APIs, right? Building an API, not being aware of the surrounding journeys, is only half the truth, right? When you understand the full journey around the data and how it's being used, you might build your API very differently. Same goes for the UX. Sometimes you might assume that the systems under the hood are just going to work in a certain way, but in reality, they don't. And there are isms that you have to take care of. No, you cannot get the user profile until you've submitted a token, which means you have to add screen XYZ first to capture this information before it can take us to this other screen. And this acts as a truing function, just making sure that everybody is aligned on a frame by frame basis. All right, Alex, I'm going to give you the final 5 minutes back.
Perfect. So next week we're doing the power outage redo of the supercharger graphs one. And then after that, we have TBD on topics. For folks that are here, we have a calendar now, so you can subscribe to it so you don't have to listen to me tell you every week, and you'll get a little calendar reminder. Other than that, I think that's all we've got this week. Awesome. We'll see y'all next week.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Great huddle, huddlers. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Bye.
I know.